Title's in the book, so but per the title, we're going to talk about slippery slopes, leaky abstractions, and ChatGPT, how ambitious site builders will customize their future Drupal sites. And before I get into that, a few acknowledgments. Our sponsors, as we heard, they've contributed quite a lot to this meeting, so we thank them. And then also this work, it's involved with National Science Foundation grant projects, and so it's been going on for a long time. And so all of those little numbers represent a separate grant that in some way or another has contributed to the funding to make this development happen. And then, of course, a lot of what I've done, couldn't be done without the Drupal community. So there's been a lot of cool stuff that people have helped me with. So what I want to do is the first part of the talk, I'm going to go through it a little bit fast if I can, and just the introduction to what I've been doing and working on, who I am, how I identify, and then we'll get into the nuts and bolts of the migration and theming, and then some thoughts that I've developed. So myself, I like to tell people I don't really identify per se as a Drupal developer. That wasn't what I set out to do. What I set out to do in life was understand biology and work in biotech companies. And that led to me getting a PhD in medicinal chemistry, and I did a postdoc in the Human Genome Project. And it was kind of fun because my career has had books written about the places I've been. I'm not really identified in all of them or any of them, but it's really great stuff. And then I started a company afterwards to do bioinformatics. So, I transitioned from the bench to the computer and did a lot with Perl and Postgres and things like that, and eventually got into commercial software. And through that, in 2008, I found Drupal at an OSCON conference, and I came back going, wow, we don't have to do websites the same way anymore. This is really cool. And my wife, who I work for now, did Digital World Biology, actually did all of this work originally, and then I took it over, and she identifies even less as a developer. So there are some real adventures in there. But the sites that we do, last year I talked about biotech careers. So that was the first one that I took from 7 to 10. Okay, and even though it's a bigger site in terms of traffic and volume of data, it's less complex than the one I'm going to talk about today, which is the Innovate Bio site that supports our national network of community colleges. And then along the way, we had funding to work on a project around antibody engineering. And so we spun up a site, and I did that on 9 so I could get my chops. And then, of course, the last one is the business site. We call that the contractor's dilemma. A contractor's house is always in disrepair because they're, doing everyone else's. So, but we'll get to that. And as I go through this, you're going to see some cute little icons on my slides. Sometimes there's an elephant. Sometimes there's a rabbit in a hole. And then sometimes there's this cheese with PHP code leaking out of it, right? And so it's really, the elephant in the room is as powerful and great as Drupal is, WordPress is easy, right? Right, and so we fight these battles all the time, and there's some issues, I think, that we still need to think about and deal with. And of course, you can go down rabbit holes anytime. That's what's exciting about software. And then the law of leaky abstractions. This was a Joel on software in 2002. So he wrote these blogs that turned into a book about his philosophy on software, and I really liked the law of leaky abstractions because it really is a paradigm or a metaphor that we all deal with. Some time ago, Dries talked about the ambitious site builder. We need to get back to supporting the ambitious site builder. So who is that person? And I identify with that, right? So we're people who spend very little time, we maybe 25% of our time in the development world, but a lot of our time is, building things and getting things done. And really where we live is life as an intermediate. We never become fully an expert. If we do, it's short-lived. Over time, we drift back to intermediate. And so, things like ChatGPT have really, and I'll just say AI in general, have really opened up this world because, it used to be that I would just be Googling and finding, Stack Overflows and digging through that code. And now I can, shorten that whole process. But, I have to look things up a lot, right? Because I just forget how to do stuff, or I never learned in the first place, right? But there's still, the drive is to build something cool, right? So, and then I put the minimal knowledge, right? You got to know about modules, web UI. In fact, I learned a lot about modules, content types, the structure of Drupal, which I love, right? That architecture, and then HTML and CSS. So my journey really began with Drupal 7. And for a long time, why didn't I move it up to 10, right? Or 9, 8, 9, and follow that? Because it was very developer-centric. And so I put how I did things, right? It was modules, web updates, live development. I didn't have a dev system. Eventually, I learned how to copy a system and make a dev system. But it was right there. SiteGround, who we use, has a great backup. So if I broke it, I could recover and keep going. And then a lot with CSS injection and patches. And patches I would just do manually, right? I didn't know how to apply a patch. No, this is one line of code I can change, and then I would document which ones I had in the documentation on the site. Drupal 9, it was the same thing. Started to move from web updates to Composer. Learned that you do Composer or you don't do Composer. You don't do web and Composer, right? And but still asset injection. And now with 10, I'm like full on, DevOps, GitHub, the whole thing. But one thing I want to point out, if you look at contributed modules, right, as we went through this journey, they've been decreasing, and 11 comes out with 7,000 modules, and people are still waiting for their module before they go from 10 to 11. That's something that I think needs to be addressed better. I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but this was the journey for biotech careers. It began in 2022. I call it the worry period. I went to a training at OSCON. That's where I learned with antibody engineers, be all in on Composer or don't. Presented to CDUG in March of 2024, and then, what are you going to do about your theme? Right? And I said, yeah, that's a good question. And so everybody said, try Tailwind and Twig. And so I did, and it was like, wow, that's really powerful. And there I have, how many YAML files and Twig files. And then we said we should do a use case. So, I talked last year about this, and we launched it in 2025. So Biotech Careers is done. Now it's time to turn to Innovate Bio. And the path here, you can see, started in 2025 in February, did my planning, 32 tabs, 36 YAML files, 161 twigs. Did I tell you the site's more complicated? It is. And, but all of that in 4 months, and I learned how to do modules. Okay, so how did I get all of this done working part-time on a site? And so before I get that, so what is Innovate Bio? So innovatebio.org is the National Science Foundation's Advanced Technological Education Biotechnology Education Center. That's a mouthful. What it is a network of community colleges that do biotech workforce education. The ATE program at NSF was set up by Congress in the mid-90s to basically prepare technicians for the high technology fields that drive our nation's economy. So it's not just biotech, it's cybersecurity, it's nuclear engineering, it's advanced automation, automotive, a lot of really kind of interesting things. It's really fascinating is all of these programs have the same problems. They just deal with different technology. And what I put here is in bold, I've highlighted just key things that, this is from the solicitation. If you're going to be a center, you will do these things, right? So we have community building projects, our NSF grants that colleges get to develop a curriculum, to do things like that. So there's a list of things we need to do, and that manifests in the website as content types, right? So community building, we do a lot of events. We have a monthly newsletter. The network itself, and it's small, but you can't read it, but we've got sentences there, and the bold are the numbers, and it's a view, yay! So all of that is dynamic. So we add a program, you come to this page, it's all dynamic content, but we have 138 college programs. Most of them are 2-year, some are 4-year. We have high school partners, 134. There's degrees and certificates. So these colleges offer degrees in just general biotechnology, biomanufacturing, tissue culture, all of these kinds of things. There's 42 topics, and then within those topics, we have a certificate, we have a 2-year degree, we have a 4-year degree, we have a post-bachelor, we have a post-master's. So there's like all these different all this nuance, right, that needs to go into this site. And then we have these ATE projects. Centers are, you need to help them. So we have 41 active ones in there, 22 that have been completed. So it's a check mark box in the form. But the point is this site is very content rich and it's very complicated, and but it's very powerful because people have found it in the government doing things like biotech education, and we right up on top. And it's led to being in reports where people have recommended Congress focus on these things. So these are the things that very satisfying when you find yourself written up, or somebody getting interviewed by the committee doing these reports. So the general architecture, this is in D10 now, is we have some 20 content types, right? And they are legitimate content types. They have different fields in them. A couple, are around the structure of the site, basic page versus a landing page, and how we do layouts and things like that. There's a few blocks because I thought, we used to have some content types for dealing with block-like things, so I've changed that. Lots of views. Views going on content, but more importantly, some database reports, and I'll give you an example of that. And oh yeah, we have books. Books. Anybody? Yay, books! I mean, the book module is great. It could use some love. There's some things that, but, and I've migrated books twice, from 6 to 7, 7 to 10. So, yeah, you can ask me about that. Taxonomies, and then storage types. I'm not going to talk about storage types, but, when I was talking about those degrees and certificates and how they map to topics, and we have articulation concepts, the credential, we have financial support, what kinds of grants a college has received, and then an image and caption, which, a lot of people do in a paragraph. I did it in a field collection. So that's how I replace field collections with storage entities. And then layout and styling is done with Display Suite, Twig, and Tailwind, and CSS. So briefly, if you're going to do a site and you're going to manage a site, you will learn DevOps. So the way we do it, we're on SiteGround. We've been there since 2009. We like SiteGround. The local development, I'm using MAMP because I just haven't gotten around to DDev. And then Composer, CodeSyncing is now with GitHub. But there's three parts of your Drupal site, right? You got the code, you got the database, and you got the files. And they all need to be loved in different ways. And so I'm doing my databases, the backup with backup and migrate. And then file sync, I use Transmit on my Mac. And it just allows me to connect things up and find my files to sync. So basically, code goes from here to the server, but content goes from the server to my local. So that's how I just keep things synced. The architecture from D7, we had a lot of functionality in modules. Did modules for everything, right? That was how you solve problems, right? How do I do this? Layout was done with panels and Display Suite, and then 27 CSS injector pages solved all the things that your theme didn't do for you. So with that, let's turn to data migration, and I want to talk about 4 things. Just basic planning. Users. This was kind of fun because like Biotech Careers has 5 users, and I wrote my own migration, and it just didn't map the roles to the users very well, and then I found a better way to do it. Image alt tags, that's always a fun thing, and then Node auto translate. Who knows what Node auto translate is? Or you're going to learn what it was. Okay. So on the planning side, just to everyone goes through this when they, it's a good time to clean your house, right? You've got things that somehow we had files that ended up in private. Oh, I did an experiment, And that required an SQL update on D7 because you gotta tell the private to be in the public at the database level, even though the files are in your private directory, right? Well, that leads to Node auto translate. Content could be a taxonomy. There is a module that would do this. And then the field collections, which I'm not going to talk about, and you can rename a lot of items. But more importantly, we have 32 tabs because we've, the site's been around, the site had been around for, 10 plus years, Drupal 6 to 7. There's a lot of stuff that accumulates. So we get to clean that up. A lot of stuff is not in the tutorials and docs. It's kind of like my experience as a chemistry student, right? Here's the NMR of ethanol, and then here's the NMR of an antibiotic. You figure out the assignments, right? We'll teach you ethanol, and then you do the really hard problem. Well, that's sort of kind of what tutorials are like. They focus on some simple things. So, I just have an example here with videos where, you run into stuff because URLs have changed and you got to learn how to do your, search and replace in your YAML. Well, it gets more complicated, right? But before that, the user, so Innovate Bio has 1,500 users in the system. So we have faculty with accounts. We have some things that you need an account for to see for our courses, and I got to migrate them. And I got to migrate the roles. Well, it turns out there's these migration scripts that ship with Drupal D7 user, and there's actually 305 migration YAMLs if you look in 78 different directories, and I stopped at users. Okay, but I tested it. It was like, oh my goodness, this worked perfectly. And then I learned, well, except for one of our fields, so I just had to copy it and then do that. But you go to I went to the web training I went to, didn't talk about it. In 31 days of Drupal migrations, they go right into teaching you how to write a migration. Not, did you look? Right? So so that's just something that if you're in this process, take a look. There might be something that could save you just a whole bunch of time. The Node Auto-Translate, yes, I did that. I did it 10 years ago. So I'm new to Drupal, new to views, and we have presentations that need to be linked to events. And I go, wow, if they're a taxonomy and we tag them, then I can link them all up. Never mind, I couldn't have done a view. But I didn't know that, right? So I did this thing, and you end up with weirdly duplicated data. And we have two content types that use this, events and degrees and certificates, and these are kind of like important things. So we want to get rid of the taxonomy, and we want to take, and all those things that were associated with taxonomy need to be associated with the node. There's one catch. Nat did not actually track the relationship between the node and the taxonomy. It just said, here's your taxonomy from your node. Yes. I see the oh my. So how am I going to solve this problem, right? So we can try to match the names. I go to ChatGPT and let's see if we can so first I try just migrating the way you do it with a lookup and nothing's happening. So I try a bunch of that, and but I had this experience with SQL, right? So maybe how about this? I create a field in the node that has the TID from the taxonomy, and what I use is the names to match it up, right? And yeah, sure, here's your update SQL, right? And that didn't work because the names may not be perfect or whatever. But I did, get a test SQL to dump the data out. So I just paste that in, and oh, here's looks like something's not working. So why don't you try that? And then that didn't work, right? So yeah, I should put a big rabbit hole on here, right? But then I said, well, what if I just add the TID manually, right, to one content and migrate that? That worked. So then it said, oh, that's a good idea. So it gave you six things to try, but one of them had field revision field nat TID. Field revision? Has anybody ever looked at their database? Yeah, so you have these tables. These tables. They have these other tables. And the other tables, the revision tables, is actually what is being used underneath the hood to link all that up. And so I said, okay, so what I need two update SQLs, and I didn't write any of this code. Okay, so, but I have my knowledge of SQL and what you can do and how you might do it, and then ChatGPT helped me figure out these coalesce and trimming and the upper and lower and all that syntax stuff to make things match up, and then the migration worked, and I was very happy. I could move on to theming. So theming, I characterize this as theming is the process of dealing with the law of leaky abstractions, right? So you get a theme you don't like. The first thing about most themes is everything is vertical. But you go, I want that to be horizontal. right? So now you've done your first CSS with inline block or a flex or something like that. So I'm beyond that now. But there's three things that came up. One was exposed filter results highlighting. So, we have a view, we've combined our fields, and we want to see the search results, right? And the pivot table, and then gin. So I think in my abstract, I had pinning stuff, which I'll just touch on at the end. But the problem is okay, so you have a list of articles. And then, I've used combined filters, exposed it, and I type in a search term, and you can see here we've gone from 544 to 139, so search works, right? And then I show it to my boss, who sits right behind me, married to her, and she says, I can't see what's been highlighted. Back in the old days, I would go, yeah, you need a module. We can't do that. So I go, well, okay. What if I asked ChatGPT, I want to do this, and I want to see my filter term in context? I gave it more detail than that. I said I want it highlighted. And so it gave me some code. And I'm just showing the very top of this, but just to show that, I'm now doing modules, right? So it gave me, because twig extension, abstract extension, look, I'm not going to figure that out on my own, or even going to a lot of Drupal conferences. I'm going to have to go sign up to do that. But, you can see we got it working. And so the first pass is, I got this title and teaser text to work, right? So the teaser's showing this. In this example, you can see underneath read more, we have another sentence. This actually came from the body, because the combined filter is searching that I only want to show the teaser text to, have the list, right? But if this term matched, I want it pulled forward. So, okay, I asked for that, got some more code. Then the links got highlighted. Well, they broke because, we put some HTML in our link to highlight that. So now I need to, okay, everything but my A tags, okay? So got some more code. Things are great on dev. Dev isn't cached. So we go up to production, and caching wrecked the whole thing. You do a search, and you see your last search results, right? So there was a rabbit hole, and you can see in my comment here, I'm rolling back to this because the more complicated approach did not solve the caching issue. So we got a more complicated approach with our file here, and I'm just showing the functions that we have and then the ultimate, replacement of the term. And really in settings, what I could do is say, if I have this combined filter, just don't cache those. Okay, so when I got done with this, then I'm left with, how do I test that? How do I know this is working, right? And so actually ChatGPT gave me a test that I could do, and I could see at the top of my site that things were not cached. So it was really just a couple days. But it's sort of nice to do a search, and since then I've gone back and CSS'd the site search, so all of those terms are yellow too, because they need to be that. So pivot tables. This was a cool views module. It was like views aggregator, but it did pivot tables, right? So you had a UI. It's gone. It's a sad module face, right? So we have this one report. We have several of these, but program fields. So I mentioned we track a lot of information about the community college programs that are in our network for a couple reasons. One is people like to be able to see and show what they have at their college. The other is for a reporting purpose, so for NSF and, things like that. We want to know things about who has articulation agreements, where the student's been employed. So we have a whole bunch of fields for a program. And this pivot table tells us how many of those fields are populated. And the yes is just using rewrite results. Yes, there's something in that field. Blank, there isn't. And then the last update, right? So how do I do that? Well, I asked ChatGPT, could I do this with Twig? And ChatGPT says, of course you could. That's a really good idea. So it's always, of course you can. That's a really good idea. And the actual logic for the pivot table is just this block of code. And what we're going to do is we're going to create unique rows from our rows, and and then do some magic with counting, and then just plug those as your variables then into the twig code that's doing the table in views table, right? View table program fields. Yes. So and so that problem got solved, and I was pretty happy. But it's also, I'm creating my own Leaky abstraction layer, because now I have logic in Twig that I used to have in the code in the database. So it's just one of those things you deal with. Gin CSS. So forms need love too. So especially if you're going to turn them loose on your people that you're expecting to enter data. And you can see here we have all these different inconsistent heading titles. Some have some pretty stuff. The overall layout is nice. So how am I going to fix this? I could do CSS injector, go back to my old ways, but that's going to be in site's default files. That's not, I can't, do git push, git pull, and have that taken care of. I could look at a different site or the site theme. Gin is actually nice. So I'm going to do some overrides. Twig, Gin says don't do it. ChatGPT actually says don't do it too, and because they read the Gin page. And then the CSS, it's just a few fields. How hard can this be? So I have to make a module. It was actually recommended by Gin. This was a rabbit hole that ChatGPT sent me down, and then I went back to the simple solution. And what I'm going to do is just make a CSS in my DWB Gin module that then I'm going to attach that library, and then now, this just looks nicer. Titles big and bold. Fields sets have a consistent heading, and the only thing, and I saw this in Andrew's. He's going to talk about unsolved Drupal problems. Tables and forms, they fall off your page when you shrink it down. And so then you have to find that table form element, and I can tell you that is not easy. That's one of those things that you work on every day for a while, for an hour, So some final thoughts, and what's next? So ChatGPT and AI in general, I'll just start with, it enabled things that I just wouldn't have done, right? So 2 years ago, I made my first module. It was called Migrate My Site, and for the next 2 years, that's the only module I have, right? And now I have a bunch of them, and not a whole bunch, but because I know the problem with having your own code, right? So, but it's really substantially decreased development time. So a lot of the if I need to translate, say, full state names to 2-letter codes, right? I can ask ChatGPT to do that. That used to be something you would have to do yourself. And you just watch this type out for you, right? And then you tell it what format you want it in. It's actually, I'm starting to understand this whole source directories code PHP file stuff, and how it translates from forward to backslash at your use statements, and how those link up, right? The ability to can interpret data, and it can interpret your code. You can paste a lot of stuff in when you're stuck. Error codes. I didn't put error codes there, but it will point you to things that you might not have seen, and then you can also there's a lot of languages that are involved here. In my other activities, I'm working on AI projects in our hackathons, with Python and those kinds of things. So I'm doing a lot of stuff with more languages than I was a Perl coder, right? So and then going through the process, you don't always get the right answer, but you go through an iteration, and if you bring your thinking cap, you're going to get some ideas, and then of course the icons I made for this talk were done with Gemini, so that's cool. But it's always obsequious, and you're always right and very smart. Don't fall for it. Okay, and it'll answer the question asked even if it's wrong, right? And it'll do that verbosely. So sometimes it's like, stop typing already. Yeah, and then you will have, you could, sometimes it's a short process, sometimes it's a long process, but you have to, you have to bring your debugging skills to figuring out how to make things work. And I highlighted this, the development experience. That is important, right? So I've talked to students and stuff about what I do with this, and they go, yeah, you already know how to do this, right? And so you do, you can still learn, but if how do you know when it's just hallucinating and rambling and giving you functions that don't exist? If it's a dot syntax kind of language, it'll start stringing together functions from words, and they don't exist. And then when you tell it doesn't exist, they go, "You're right, that doesn't exist." So, and then old software versions, because remember, it's been trained on the internet. There's more old data than there is new data, right? So you're going to get things that drush 8 commands when you're on drush 13. So it's just you have to be aware of that, and usually you just try it and it doesn't work, and you go, oh yeah, right. So and I also want to point out, so far I've really only used the free resources. I've used Claude. Claude will, ChatGPT is not getting me there. I go to Claude. Claude gives me a few tries and says, now you need to put some money in the meter. At least with ChatGPT, it says, well, now you're using 4, not 5. And it's like, but I don't know the difference. So, things I didn't talk about. This is the pinning select list. So, I have 50 articles in this list. It's scrolling. You scroll down a ways. You've clicked an article, and it shows here, but you don't know what article you're looking at anymore in your select list. So we use some JavaScript to pin those to the top. These kinds of things. This is a menu that's just a horizontal menu, but there's 14. That really doesn't fit on a wide page. So you're scrolling through, and then I click that. I want that there looking like a tab. So those are a couple problems we solved. Updating nodes. You've done your migration. Maybe storage types, you've set your token to use a particular field like the TID because for debugging that was useful. But for a user, that's not useful. What they want is a field there, right? They want the name of what they put in. And so, like anything, you add a field to a content type, it's only going to be for going forward. How do you retrospectively fill that? Well, maybe just if you touched them all and saved them, right? And so, so little things like that, PHP for a drush command that you can do. You use this, fixing entity references that have corresponding entity references. Again, if you have to touch everything and you've got 300 of them, that's a really nice way to do that. The 2-letter codes. Yes, I want a URL that looks like this, but I forget exactly why I needed to do that, but I needed to. And then full calendar. So if people wanted an event calendar, it's really great. You can color by taxonomy. But we have innovative bio events. We have events that we've advertised for the community. I want those colored too. Those are fields. I'm not going to make taxonomies for 2 terms, right? So for a Boolean. So again, that was just another module. Moving. Oh yeah, register by link in your body text. I don't want that showing after the event. We're done registering. It's over. and then lots of theme work. Okay, so. And then some git commands, bash scripts. I can't hardly do an update without doing git. This Drupal changed this file on me, and now it's colliding. So, what I love about Drupal is the architecture. A lot of modules made the journey. A few didn't make it. And then we're going to be working on a skills database. People familiar with Mermaid? Yeah, I want to create a module where we have, we talk about these pathways. I go to high school, I go to college, I go to the job, I go back. I was thinking they have, the Git management. Make nice pathway diagrams, yeah. And then a better integration with biotech careers, lots more AI sessions, and of course getting to the house, so to speak. And then, just some things to think about, right? Drupal does remain developer-centric, and I think that's a challenge for its use in the community. It's still dropping. It didn't drop as much as last year. I will say, last year when I did this, version 7 was 42%, version 10 was 27%. You can see that that ratio is changing nice. So people are updating their sites. And but 11 is still behind, and I think some of that is the module loss that accompanies these version upgrades. And so can AI help with that? And we have we have about 10 minutes for questions. Yeah.
So what makes you decide when you have to make a model? Because I haven't had to mess with any admin CSS. Why couldn't you just add the library without creating a module?
So if it's, I guess if it's kind of fundamental to something in the view or presentation, so like full calendar, right? I have all this stuff set up where I can color by taxonomy. One taxonomy, maybe I can check two, but I can't color the events by a field in the content type. So I have to kind of grab that data early in the process. So it's not my first approach, right? But for some of these modules, drush commands, those are just going to be modules. And I'm dealing with one with biotech careers. I changed our job board, and that instead of getting a job board's URL API, I get a file, and every hour I have to update that file. I have to parse that file. I have to, so that's going to be at the code level, PHP for that, and so that's going to be a module. And we didn't use, for all the job boards we've had our own module, because that's just a kind of how would I say it? Not fundamental, but it's a code level. Kind of did that.
Yeah, no.
Anybody got a better answer?
No, that's fair. Well, because I know I try.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've experienced a little bit with training with ChatGPT, and I feel like more often than not, it wants to throw out just make a module, and when I see that, I kind of just either refactor my question or go do my own research. I feel like it recommends modules too often for
really?
even some smaller tests.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'm not.
If I'm just trying to do some basic templating, as opposed to a pre-process, sometimes I'll suggest a module.
Okay, yeah. So, but there were some things in Twig. Actually, I needed functions that were, and my first modules weren't modules; they were theme functions. So, if I go back, the detail I didn't tell you about this part. This is green because it's active. Anybody ever notice in views in Drupal 7, you had an is active CSS tag? It's gone. So I need to know what node ID is here. And then I can set it active in Twig. So to get that node ID, I have to do a function call. And that puts you in, a block of PHP. Yeah. And same for taxonomy, because otherwise I can't CSS that different. So this is, if you're looking at this, you'd be looking at this article. Yeah. Yeah, and that it started there, and then it was like, okay, this theme file is getting pretty unwieldy. But it has 4 functions in it now on Innovate Bio. I think I've listed them here. Not here. Anybody remember my talk? Yeah, here we go. So some hooks, active items, the theme suggestions. Yeah, layout builder. You don't know what layout you're looking at unless you get in and put in your own theme suggestions. The taxonomy page title, taxonomy. Martin will tell you that. Taxonomy is a little opinionated. I had to do some real twigging around to fix some things there. There's a page layout issue, and live reload in dev. That's a theme function, so it's not doing it out of production. Yeah?
So 90% of my experience trying to use ChatGPT for this stuff is what you talked about, where it's like, no problem, here's a twig function that doesn't exist, and I'll say exactly what you said, that doesn't exist, and I'll say, okay, maybe you're right. And then it'll suggest a different one that also doesn't exist, because I'm going to it once the problem is hard enough that I'm not having luck with
Yeah.
Google or documentation. So what have you done to get around that? Because to me, I essentially am like, I'm already frustrated with Google, and now ChatGPT is giving me something that doesn't exist.
Yes. So if you're not finding it on Google,
Yeah.
You're probably working on a problem that's beyond.
ChatGPT.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. So maybe I'm just working on more basic stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I had a recommendation for you. So,
Yeah.
if you really want solid answers from the AI, the best way to get those solid answers is to tell it what code to look at.
Uh-huh.
So I don't use just like the ChatGPT chat
Yeah.
window. I use Cursor or I use GitHub Copilot built into my IDE, and then I actually tell it, based on this code structure, what would you recommend? Have it read your code before it gives you an answer. Better yet, have it read core code before it gives you an answer. Because like a lot of the things you're describing there in terms of doing custom modules and whatnot, you're going down a path of doing something different in core, which is going to be hard to upgrade. So always just try to feed it the context before asking it the question, and it'll give you much better answers.
I have a question / maybe suggestion. Suggestion that I have not had the time to get into, but this is a very real problem. It hallucinates, makes up functions. There is something, this is a buzzword, MCP, Model Context Protocol. I have not done it with Drupal, but I have done it in Cursor. I was able to add an MCP server. This was for a Next.js project, but you can basically kind of supplement, like, I don't know if ChatGPT should be able to do it soon, I'm hoping, but you should be able to say, hey, here's this, if anybody knows of a Drupal one, I would love it to know that, because we are also as a team struggling using AI in Drupal development specifically, but there are these context servers for developers that scrape the documentation and create a little server so you can say, hey, Copilot
Yeah.
we use. One I used was called Context 7. That was for Next.js, and it did like JavaScript and stuff. But if anybody knows of a Drupal one, I think that's where we're going to start getting that, like, okay, yes, the internet says this, but then, like, here's the Drupal AI-friendly, digestible documentation.
Yeah.
So I'm curious if you guys have heard of any movement in the Drupal community on that? No? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, these are the things I think about at night.
I don't tend to use
I
it
haven't had
that
time
way.
to
Yeah.
get to.
But yeah, to your question, a lot of problems I saw, if I do a Google search, there's a lot of stuff. And that's also a signal of success.
Sure.
That you get. And I do put code in ChatGPT too to go, okay, I need, I need to focus on this. Yeah. Or it to focus on that. We shouldn't say you. Or he or she.
I will say, I think I've always made the point that when you're learning Drupal, the big challenge is figuring out a way to do a thing.
Yeah.
And then when you reach a certain point, you can immediately think of 10 ways to do the thing, and the challenge becomes which of these is going to be more robust and more extensible down the road.
Yeah.
And I think AI is very poorly equipped to make those architectural choices.
I agree.
I think it's much better as in a pair programming model where you're saying, hey, I need a function that accepts 2 arrays as input, evaluates them, removes duplicates, and returns a sorted array. Where you're giving it very specific guidance and limiting its scope.
Yes. Yes, and I'm doing things I have no idea in a lot of ways. Especially, I made that comment about those paths in a module. Source, it could be source, drush, command. I'm starting to kind of learn it, but I still don't know what the best practice is and why I have why I'm doing a service versus a. I did kind of get my head around the .module file and hooks, but the rest of it is, black box.
But it's a little old school, but I still think there's a lot of value in logging the debug backtrace in code so you can see all of the progressive functions that are being evaluated to return the result.
Yeah. Yeah. See, what I'd like is a good way just to spit that out on the page so I can see it without having to go to my log.
Right. I mean, with Devel and Kint,
Okay. Yeah, because I've just been I haven't used Kint. So.
it just styles the output from Devel a little nicer.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, last year's talk was about walking through all of those render arrays to find your thing in Twig. Yes, and yeah, and there that is fraught with risk. That you got the thing to work, but it wasn't the right thing, and then later you find out why. Yeah. So, all right. Well, thanks. We're right at 10. So, yeah.